Okay, chapter 224. I am bracing myself because they gave us like 4 happy chapters in a row, which means things are going to go bad. Chapter 224, Mr. Banks's house in Globe Lane. The evening appointed by Catherine in her note to Mr. Banks for the purchase of the papers relating to her birth had now arrived. It was nearly 8 o'clock. The undertaker was at work in his shop, the door of which stood open, and several idle vagabonds were standing near the entrance, watching the progress that was made in bringing a new coffin to completion. Somehow or another, people always do stop at the door of undertakers' workshops, doubtless actuated by feelings of the same morbid nature as those which call crowds of faces to the windows in a street along which a funeral is passing. Mr. Banks had laid aside his coat and appeared in his dingy shirt sleeves. He wore a paper cap upon his head, and a long apron was tied very high up above his waist, reaching indeed almost to the waistcoat pockets. As the gas was not laid on in his establishment, he was working by the light of a couple of tallow candles that flickered in a most tantalizing manner. With the draft from the open door, leaving Mr. Banks every other minute in a state of exciting suspense as to whether they were about to be extinguished or to revive again. Still, he did not choose to adopt the very natural precaution of closing the shop door, because he considered it businesslike to have a group of idlers collected at the entrance. And there was an air of business about Mr. Banks's establishment. There were shining white coffin plates hanging along one row of panes in the window, and black ones suspended along another row. At a central pane hung a miniature coffin lid covered with black cloth and studded with nails in the usual manner. The shop itself was crowded with coffins in different stages toward completion. The floor was ankle-deep in shavings and sawdust, and carpenter's tools of all kinds lay scattered about. But preeminently conspicuous amongst all these objects was a glass case standing upon a little shelf, and enclosing that very miniature model of the patent coffin which he had displayed at the farmhouse near Hounslow. Mr. Banks was busily employed in fitting a lid to a coffin which stood upon the trestles in the middle of the shop, and his 2 eldest boys, one 15 and the other 13, were occupied, the first in planing a board and the second in sawing a plank. Well, mused Mr. Banks to himself as he proceeded with his work, I hope Miss Kate won't fail to keep her appointment, particular as Tidkins seems so sure of the job. That other feller, which came yesterday to look at my first floor front as is to let, never returned, and yet he appeared to like the blessed place well enough. Goodness knows he asked questions by the dozen and looked in every cranny about the house. Someone looking to figure out where Tidkins is going to be hiding. What did he want to bother himself like that as to whether there was a good yard for his missus to hang her clothes in on washing days? He should have sent her to see all about that. Then he would see where the yard wall looked and whether there was a yard on a street on the other side, and all about it. I really thought he would have taken the rooms, but perhaps he didn't like the coffins. Perhaps his missus don't fancy that they're constant hammering. It's a sinful world. And as if deeply impressed by this conviction, the undertaker shook his head solemnly. He then continued his employment for some time without musing upon any one topic in particular. At length he broke silence altogether. Now, Ned, said he to his eldest born, he had 5 or 6 smaller specimens of the Bankses' breed indoors, as he raised his head from his work and looked severely round toward the lad, that's quite plaining enough. The board'll be very thin as an egg. Wait, sometimes it's hard to read his speeches because he mumbles words together. Okay. Now, Ned, said he to his eldest born, as he raised his head from his work and looked severely round towards the lad, that's quite plaining enough. The board'll be weared as thin as an egg case before it's used. Make it on economical principles, boy. Economic principles, I say, mind, added Mr. Banks sternly. It ain't economic principles to turn out coffins as rough as if they don't know what planing is, returned the youth, because the friends of the defuncts will only send them back again. The friends of the defuncts will do no such thing to a respectable furnisher of funerals like me, as has lived, man and boy, in the same house for 50 years and paid his way regular, responded Mr. Banks. If we adopts economic principles, we can't waste wood or time either. And do you mean to say, father, cried the boy, that this here plank is planed enough? Pass your hand along it, and it'll get covered with splinters, stuck all over like a porcupine. It will do exceedingly well for the blessed carcass that'll rejoice in such a lid as that board will help to make him, said Banks, sweeping his palm over the plank. It's good enough. That's economic principles. Then economic principles is a fool and a humbug, returned the lad sulkily. That's all I can say about the matter. "Oh, that's it, is it?" cried Banks, assuming a threatening attitude. "Yes, with a vengeance," added his son. "No, that's the vengeance," said Mr. Banks coolly as he dealt his heir a tremendous box on the ear, which forced the young man nearly over the plank that had caused the dispute. But as the lad was not quite floored, his father bestowed on him a kick which speedily succeeded the slap and leveled the youthful coffin-maker altogether. Sounds like a fun, happy home life, doesn't it? "Bravo!" shouted the idlers at the door. The discomfited son of Mr. Banks got up, retreated to the farther end of the shop, and was about to discharge a volley of insolence at his father, when a gentleman and lady suddenly appeared on the threshold of the shop. "Ah, Miss Wilmot!" exclaimed Mr. Banks, punctual to the time. "Your most obedient, sir," he added, turning towards Kate's companion, whom he did not know personally, but who was really Richard Markham. "I had a feeling." "Walk in, miss, walk in, sir." Then, without farther ceremony, the undertaker banged the door violently in the faces of the loungers at the shop entrance. "Please to come this way," he said again, turning to his visitors. "Take care of that lid, miss. It'll soon cover a blessed defunct as a widder and 7 small children is now a weepin' for. I'm doing it cheap for 'em, poor things, 18 pence under the regular charge, 'cause they had to sell their bed to pay for it in advance. This way, sir, mind them trestles. Many coffins has stood on them, all made on the newest and most economic principles. For my maxim is that a cheap and good undertaker is a real blessing to society, a perfect godsend in this world of wanity and vexation. What would the poor sinful vessels in this neighborhood do without me? What indeed?" Thus, taking and shaking his head in a most solemn manner, Mr. Banks led the way to a parlor behind the shop, and when his 2 visitors had entered it, he closed the door to prevent the intrusion of his sons. "Pray sit down, miss, sit down, sir," said the undertaker, doing the honors of his abode with all the politeness of which he was a master. "I am truly glad to behold your blessed countenance again, miss, for it's a sinful world, and blessed countenance is scarce, very scarce. And this gentleman, I haven't the pleasure of knowing who." "It's no matter who I am," said Richard. "The agreement between Miss Wilmot and yourself was that she should visit you, accompanied by a friend. I am that friend. Let us now proceed to business." And as he spoke, our hero coolly produced a brace of pistols, which he laid upon the table. "Sir, Miss Kate, I hope," stammered the undertaker, turning pale and recoiling in alarm. "Fear nothing," said Markham. "It is merely a necessary precaution. The young lady and myself are in a strange neighborhood. I have about me a considerable sum of money for the purpose of buying certain papers which you profess to have, and you will pardon me if I have thought fit to adopt every precaution, yes, every precaution," he added emphatically, to guard against treachery. "But surely that dear creature, Miss Catherine, with her angelic countenance," said Banks, "must have told you, sir, that I am a respectable man, as was well known to Mr. Smithers, and that I should scorn to act dishonorable to any blessed living vessel." "We will not dispute upon the point, sir," returned our hero in an authoritative tone. "I have my reasons for acting with caution. If you intend us no harm, none can befall you. Where are these papers?" I love that Richard has become this, like, no, I'm in charge. I'm getting this done. I have authority now. When we first met him, he was this little innocent, naive boy being taken in by criminals and getting in trouble because he was too quiet and too, yeah, I guess naive is the right word. And now he's like, I'm taking charge. Richard. "The papers, sir? Oh, the papers is safe now," said Banks, still hesitating. "But them pistols will remain until the bargain is concluded," added Markham. "Again, I say that I mean fairly, if you do." Thus speaking, he drew forth a pocketbook, and opening it, displayed to the undertaker's eager eyes a number of banknotes. "Business, it looks like business," murmured Banks, "in spite of them blessed cussed pistols. You see, dear pretty miss, and you, good sir, that a man moving in such an important sphere as myself sees so much of the pomps and vanities—" "A truce to these unnecessary observations, Mr. Banks," said Markham, somewhat sternly, "or you will compel me to think that you are only talking to gain time, which could not be for any proper motive. In one word, then, have you the papers which relate to this young lady's parentage?" "I have, sir, I have indeed," returned the undertaker. With these words, he slowly unlocked an old walnut wood desk, which stood in a recess, and thence he took a brown paper parcel, tied round with coarse strings and sealed in several places. "This is just as I received the blessed documents from my friend," he said, leisurely advancing towards the table. Then, taking a seat, he handed the parcel to Markham, observing, "You may break it open and satisfy yourself that its contents is genuine. 2 minutes will be enough for that, and 2 minutes is all my friend told me to give for the purpose. I haven't read a line of them myself, and I know nothing of what they say, but my friend is as sharp a feller as here and there, and he assures me that they're going dirt cheap, like workhouse coffins." While Banks was thus indulging his Garrulity. I don't know that word. That's been a fun thing about reading these, is I'm coming across words I don't know. So I'm expanding my vocabulary. Markham had opened the parcel by the aid of a pair of scissors which laid upon the table, and the first thing which struck him was a letter addressed to Mr. Markham, Markham Place. Catherine, who watched him attentively without, however, looking at the papers herself, observed him start as if with sudden surprise. Then he tore open the letter with almost a wild precipitation and glanced rapidly over the contents. As he read, his countenance became flushed, and his features expressed mingled joy and astonishment, joy the most fervent, astonishment the most profound. "How wondrous are thy ways!" he exclaimed, throwing down the letter ere he had fully perused it. "Catherine, dearest girl, come to my arms, for you are my sister, my own sister." "Your sister, Richard," murmured the young maiden as she sank almost fainting upon her brother's breast. That was our guess, right? That she was his father's daughter with her mother, and that's why his name was part of it. Okay, we'll see where this goes. "Yes, my sister Kate, my own sister." And he embraced her tenderly. "Compose yourself, dear girl, compose yourself. This is no place for explanations. But you are not the less my sister, and I thank God for it. I have now a natural right to be your protector, and a protector as well as an affectionate brother will you ever find in me." "Oh, Richard, this sudden, this unexpected happiness is too much," exclaimed Catherine, weeping through varied but ineffable emotions. "Is it possible that he whom I have known as a benefactor is indeed a brother?" "I cannot doubt it. I do not wish to doubt it," returned Markham. "No, I am happy that I have found a sister in her whom I already loved as one." And again he embraced her tenderly. "And I find a brother in the noblest and best of men," murmured Catherine. "It appears to be a dream, a delicious dream." "It is a reality," said Richard, "and we shall now all be happier than ever. Oh, what a surprise for those at home!" "Then you perceive, my lord, that the document is of some value," answered Mr. Banks, wiping his eyes with the limp ends of his cravat as if deeply affected by the scene. "I knowed they was, and I now begin to think that I have found out your name. I'm sure it's a unspeakable honor that a great lord and prince like you has done my poor house by setting foot in it, and all amongst the coffins, too." "Let us now conclude this business, sir," exclaimed Richard, with whom the undertaker's remarks passed unheeded. So absorbed were his thoughts in the signal discovery which he had just made. "These papers are mine, and this pocket-book is yours. You may examine its contents." "Oh, I've no doubt they're all right, my lord," said Banks, grasping the treasure now handed to him, "but I'll just look over 'em, merely for form's sake. It's more business-like, and nice new flimsies they are, too," continued the undertaker, as he scrutinized the notes one by one. "Ah, what miserable vessels we should be without money, my lord, in this wicked world, and what would become of us if our friends had no cash to buy us nice coffins when we were blessed defunct carcasses? It's awful to think of. 450s, 200s, and 1010s, that's 500, sure enough." And Mr. Banks proceeded to lock up the pocketbook with its valuable contents in his desk. Richard and Catherine rose as if to depart. "Maybe, your lordship, and this pretty young lady will just wash your mouths out," said Mr. Banks, attempting a pleasant smile. "A little drop of wine, one glass, and I'll step myself to the public-house to fetch it." "Do so," returned Markham, throwing a sovereign upon the table. Catherine looked at her brother in astonishment, but he affected not to perceive the impression which his strange conduct had thus created. Banks seemed overjoyed at the affability of the nobleman, and gathering up the piece of gold, the change out of which he already considered as his own prerequisite, had hastened to execute the commission, but not without trying the lid of the desk ere he left the room, to convince himself that it was securely locked. He passed through the shop, which was empty, and muttering to himself something about his unnatural boy, who had gone off to the public without finishing the economic coffins, opened the street door and went out. The moment he was gone, Richard seized his pistols, and saying in a hurried tone to Catherine, "Remain here, dear sister, for a few moments," hastened from the room by a door leading to the inner part of the dwelling. He rushed down a passage and entered the yard as if well acquainted with the undertaker's premises. The moment he set foot in the yard, he whistled in a particular manner. "Treachery!" cried a man darting forward from the corner near the window. "Stand, or I fire!" exclaimed Markham, advancing towards him and presenting a pistol. "Fool!" said the man, and he threw himself with desperate fury upon our hero. But Richard, maintaining his footing gallantly, closed with his assailant, and threw him to the ground, his pistol going off with the shock, without, however, inflicting any injury. And at the same moment, 3 police officers leapt over the wall in time to put an end to the struggle between Markham and his opponent, the latter of whom they made their prisoner and immediately bound with strong cords. "Is your highness hurt?" asked one of the officers. "No, Benstead," was the reply. "A little bruised, perhaps, but it is nothing. Bring the prisoner this way." The whole transaction, from the moment when Richard left the undertaker's parlor to that when he re-entered it, followed by the policeman with the captive, had not occupied 2 minutes. He found Catherine reclining back in her chair, half fainting and paralyzed by terror, so deeply had the report of the pistol and the concomitant scuffle in the yard alarmed her. But the moment she heard her brother's voice, she started up, gazed wildly around, and threw herself into his arms. "You are not hurt, Richard? Oh, tell me, that pistol!" she exclaimed, terror still depicted on her countenance. "No, dear sister, I am not hurt," exclaimed Richard. "Calm yourself. Everything has resulted according to my expectations. Look, Kate, that terrible man is at length in the hands of the officers of justice." Catherine turned a rapid glance towards the group on the other side of the room and beheld the sinister and ferocious countenance of the individual whom she had seen in the company of the old hag near Bennet's farm. At this moment, the door communicating with the shop opened, and Mr. Banks made his appearance, carrying a bottle in his hand. He started back in astonishment and alarm when his eyes encountered the police officers with his friend Anthony Tidkins securely bound in the midst of them. But as his glances wandered from one to the other, he suddenly appeared to recollect something, and fixing his eyes on Benstead, he exclaimed, "Ah, now I twig it all. What a cussed fool I was not to know a trap even in plain clothes, but I was blind because I thought I'd get a 'spectable man come in as a first-floor lodger. No wonder you poked your nose in every hole and corner, especially the yard. I was an idiot, an addle-pated old vessel. But perhaps the gentlemen will take a glass of wine since they're here," added Mr. Banks with a smirking countenance. This semi-pleasantry on his part was only assumed, for his own life had not been so immaculate as to preclude the existence of certain fears when he found himself in the dangerous vicinity of the police. He was, however, speedily reassured on this head. "Keep your wine, sir," exclaimed Markham. "For those who can enjoy it in your company, and consider yourself fortunate that, in becoming the agent of that man," he pointed with deep disgust towards Tidkins, "you have not committed yourself in any way which at present endangers your safety. I see that you glance uneasily at your desk. You need not fear that I shall attempt to deprive you of the sum which you have extorted as the purchase money for the papers now in my possession. No, although I do not envy you the feelings which could prompt you thus to lend yourself to make a market of secrets so sacred as those which the documents contain, I cannot question your right to act thus, seeing that the papers were in your possession, and were I compelled to pay 1,000 times the sum given to obtain them, I should consider they were cheaply bought. But you cannot understand such feelings," he added, addressing these words to the undertaker, but glancing affectionately towards Catherine. "I hope there's no offence, my lord," said Banks, shaking in every limb with vague fears and suspicions. "I'm a poor man which tries to live honest by undertaking on the most economic principles, and there isn't a carcass as goes through my hands that wouldn't sign a certificate in my favor if it could." Richard turned his back contemptuously upon Mr. Banks, and addressing himself to Benstead, asked where he intended to lodge the prisoner for the night. "There isn't a station house in London that would be safe to put such a desperate feller in," was the reply. "He'd get out as sure as my name is Morris Benstead. I shall take him direct to Coldbath Fields, where the keeper will be sure to give him accommodation. Tomorrow your highness will be so kind as to appear against him at Lambeth Street." Markham promised compliance with this request. A cab was sent for, and the Resurrection Man, who had maintained a moody silence, although he never ceased from looking vindictively upon our hero from the moment he was arrested, was now removed in safe custody. The prince then conducted Catherine to the carriage that was waiting for them in another street, and shortly after 10 o'clock they reached Markham Place. We shall pass over all elaborate details of the surprise and joy with which Isabella, Ellen, and Mr. Monroe received the intelligence that Catherine was our hero's sister, his sister without what the world calls the stigma of illegitimacy. Suffice it to say that the discovery produced the most unfeigned pleasure in the breasts of all, and that Kate became the object of sincerest congratulations. Richard then related as succinctly as possible, for he longed to peruse the precious documents in his possession, the capture of the Resurrection Man, and the scheme by which he had placed that villain in the hands of the officers of justice. "I felt persuaded," he said, "that Tidkins did not put implicit confidence in Banks, and that he intended to watch the negotiation. His avarice engendered suspicions and got the better of his prudence. I communicated my views yesterday morning to a faithful officer whom I know, and Morris Benstead, the person to whom I allude, visited the undertaker's house on a pretense of hiring apartments which were to let. By those means he was enabled to reconnoitre the premises and adopt measures accordingly. The result has answered my anticipations, and that consummate villain who twice attempted my life, and whose atrocities are numerous as the hairs on his head, is at length in custody." "Ah, dearest Richard," said Isabella, "wherefore should you have thus perilled your precious life?" "Do not chide me, Isabel," exclaimed the prince, kissing her tenderly. "I only performed a duty that I owe alike to society and to myself. Let us now examine these documents which have already made so strange and yet so welcome a revelation." The members of that happy party drew round the table, and Richard began by reading the various letters that accompanied the old woman's narrative. But as those epistles merely corroborated the main points of her tale, we shall not quote them. The narrative itself will explain all, and that important document may be found in the ensuing chapter. Okay, so in the next chapter, we get to find out the whole history of Catherine's mother and Richard's father and how all this came to be. All right, see you in the next one.